Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I call the room to order? Thank you. Thank you for taking your seat. Thank you very much. Thank you. Your Excellency, Ms. Inge Anderson, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, Your Excellency, Ms. Stephy Lemke, Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection of Germany, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pierre Quiblier, Coordinator of the SAICEM Secretariat. It is a great honor for me to be here today to welcome you to the opening ceremony of the high-level segment of the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management. During this very busy year on the international and chemical agenda, we are very fortunate to have with us today the august presence of distinguished officials and a large number of high-level stakeholders, all reflecting the active and needed engagement of the wider community in chemical and waste management issues. To begin our program, we are very privileged to hear a video message from His Excellency Olaf Scholz, Federal Chancellor of Germany.
Every day we benefit from the use of chemical products, be it in the agricultural or the medical sector, in cutting-edge tech, or in the clothing industry, or at home using a dishwasher or simply brushing our teeth. The use of chemicals is an integral aspect of modern-day lives. The chemical industry creates good jobs, including here in Germany, and is an indispensable part of our global value chains. However, the global mismanagement of chemicals and chemical waste has led to a crisis across our entire planet. According to the World Health Organization, toxic pollution caused by chemicals threatens millions of lives every year, especially in developing countries. Persistent synthetic chemicals are present in the ground, water and air, even in the remotest corners of our planet. They have an impact on biodiversity and pollute the very resources that we need to survive. All of this underlines the need to take joint action. This is where you and your conference come in. You have the opportunity to define how the global community will manage chemicals and waste in the future. I would therefore like to encourage you to make ambitious commitments in the high-level declaration that is set to be adopted at the end of your conference. I think we all agree that it is necessary to increase institutional and legal capacities to reach a consensus on the data that we want to gather and to create synergies with existing programming, for instance in the fields of climate or biodiversity protection. Documents like the one that you are negotiating here in Bonn can provide guidance to the entire UN system. They will serve as points of reference for the private sector, academia and civil society. And they can raise global awareness and lead to collaborative action. If they entail clear commitments from all sides, if they are truly ambitious, I know that is what you are working towards. People around the planet are rooting for your success, and that includes me. Thank you for what you are doing, and a warm welcome to the World Conference Center in the UN city of Bonn.
I would like to thank His Excellency for his very inspiring words. It is now my sincere pleasure to invite Ms. Inge Anderson, Executive Director of UNEP, Ms. Anderson, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Let me start by saying my deep thanks to Germany, our host and president of this, the 5th International Conference on Chemical Management, ICCM 5. And of course to all the delegates who are in this room and beyond who've been working so hard, putting in hard work at negotiating this new global chemicals instrument. Friends, we are close to a deal that will help retain the benefits of chemicals while protecting human, environmental, planetary, as well as economic health. And in the next few days, actually hours, a close to a deal must become a closed deal. What we're working on was supposed to be the Beyond 2020 framework of the sound management of chemicals and waste, not beyond the 2023 framework, but we all know that COVID had different plans for us and that there are reasons for not delivering the deal earlier. But there can be no reasons for further delay. We know the positions, we know the issues, we know the science, and we are fully aware of what we need to do. Yet chemicals are essential for medicines, for consumer products, for food and more, but unsound management across the life cycle means hazardous and long-lived chemicals are polluting our air, our water, our land, and our bodies. Since the original deadline for this new framework, this deadline of 2020, based on WHO numbers, we can say that close to 6 million people may likely have died from exposure to chemicals in the air, in the water, in our food, and in the workplace. And countless ecosystems and species may well have been polluted and poisoned, and trillions of dollars of damages may well have occurred. But the chemical sector is growing, and so how can we have that growth that is sustainable? And without reform, we risk in certain places that the harm caused by unsound management of chemicals could also grow, and could grow fast. So adopting this new framework in the strongest and most specific and most inclusive terms, backed by the right finance for developing nations, is urgent. So I urge everyone to show compromise and creativity to get the job done for us and for the generations to come. I ask for compromise because it is a complex deal of a sort. It's not possible for everyone to get everything. That's how it works in negotiations. But let me be clear, I'm not asking for compromise in which everyone is unhappy. But I am asking for compromise in which everybody gets enough of what they want to make this framework workable. I ask for creativity because that's how we will make compromises work. I'm talking about creativity from companies, from nations, and from civil society and science that produce, use, or sell chemicals. Look, back in the day when the ozone layer was being depleted, governments and industry found alternatives to CFCs and made change happen. The cooling industry is booming today and is lauded for protecting the ozone layer. There is no reason that the same thing cannot happen in the chemicals and chemical-dependent industries. And in the spirit of the recognized human right to a safe, sound, and sustainable environment, I ask governments to dream up new policies and incentives that will help pull the chemical industry and other key sectors like agriculture, construction, and manufacturing to adapt their new practices. And I ask the trillion-dollar chemical industries to get ahead of the game and show what it can do, for example, in finding green and sustainable alternatives to hazardous chemicals. In this regard, I ask all parties to support the plastic pollution deal that is under negotiation, as mentioned in the draft text, to remove harmful chemicals from plastics and to find safe alternatives to plastic. We need chemists and the ingenuity from that sector and engineering working at the top of their game in this regard. And I ask everyone to support the UNEP-hosted Science Policy Panel negotiations on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention. And as the interim panel on climate change and the intergovernmental as the intergovernmental IPCC and IPBES have shown, science can provide solutions and spark innovation as well as a better and deeper understanding. So I'm talking also about creativity in financing. Other agreements have stalled over what kind of pot that needs to be created for financing. Funding mechanisms are important, but are we perhaps missing the bigger picture? Is it the pot that matters, or is it what we put in it? After all, there's no point of handing a pot to somebody dying of thirst, but forgetting to fill it with water. So I challenge everyone to focus on their creativity on financing solutions from many sources. We have seen solutions in the past: blended finance, funding windows in existing mechanisms, innovative fiscal policies, debt swaps, and more. What are the creative solutions that this instrument can help deliver and unlock the necessary finance? So friends, 2030 is the year in which we're supposed to reach and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. We just had the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in New York on the sidelines of the General Assembly. National targets to keep climate change in check under the Paris Agreement, and wide-ranging ambitious targets on the Global Biodiversity Framework. Without strong and urgent action on ending chemical and waste pollution, these commitments, the SDGs, will not be met. Look, I understand that there's great upheaval and that this represents complexity, but it is a necessary complexity, and it is an upheaval that can lighten the burden of the unsound management of chemicals and waste, safeguard the planetary systems we all depend on, and keep private sector players and economies in fine financial fettle. We are within touching distance of a deal that will help deliver a pollution-free world. So I ask nations and their negotiators and everyone else at the table to take that last step. Grab the deal with both hands, lean in, and start deliver on this vision of a planet free of harm from chemicals and waste for a safe and healthy and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson, for your re-energizing call for action and most valuable leadership in making this conference a historic opportunity to translate our abstract concepts into concrete reality. It is now my honor to invite Her Excellency Ms. Stephy Lemke, Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of Germany. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, colleagues, directors, board members, stakeholder representatives, Inga Anderson, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the high-level segment on the 5th session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management. Inga Anderson and I are jointly hosting this high-level segment, and we want to discuss with you how we can step up the political pressure in future in the fight against the pollution crisis. The pollution crisis affects all aspects of our lives. We cannot implement the goals of the 2030 Agenda or keep our promise to leave no one behind without sustainable chemicals and waste management. Colleagues, our goal for ICCM5 is to adopt ambitious targets and effective measures for sound chemical management. In Rio, back in 1992, the international community essentially already agreed to significantly reduce pressures on humans and the environment caused by chemicals. To this day, we have not come close enough to achieving this goal. I believe this is partly due to a lack of knowledge of this issue and its link to other areas. In future, we will have to intensify our efforts yet again to raise public awareness of chemicals pollution. We made progress on this at the second Berlin Forum on Chemicals and Sustainability, which we hosted at the beginning of September. I was delighted how many of you accepted my invitation. At the Berlin Forum, we shone a spotlight on some new aspects. For example, the economic, social, and environmental costs that will arise unless we significantly improve chemicals and waste management throughout the world. Valerie Hickey, Global Director at the World Bank, will speak more on this shortly. UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell has given us a compelling account of the impacts of lead on children. The WTO has highlighted the importance of chemicals management standards for global trade. Another reason for the slow progress on chemicals management is a lack of funding. Financial support is required for competence building, knowledge sharing, and for ensuring that countries that have just started developing their chemicals management receive the funding they need. For example, to set up the necessary authorities. Germany will provide 10 million euros for implementing the framework to support necessary future activities in this regard. Of course, problems cannot all be solved with money alone. Above all, we need the political will to make changes. Colleagues, let us express this will to act in our joint high-level declaration. A declaration in which we call on all stakeholders, not only those present today, to play their part in achieving the goals to be adopted at ICCM 5. To seek solutions, share them with others, and implement them together. My wish is that the UN organizations and other international institutions communicate our goals to their stakeholders. This will ensure that safe management of chemicals and waste is systematically taken into account in sectors like energy, building, transport, and finance too. I would like to see the UN General Assembly take a closer look at the implementation of the UN Chemicals and Waste Agenda. Such attention will help combat pollution, and it sends a clear signal to develop innovations for sustainable chemistry. Colleagues, I grew up in the former East Germany, in a region where chemical industry discharges made the river smell terrible and the water shimmer with all kinds of colors. This reckless treatment of our natural environment was one of the reasons I went into politics. That is why I'm delighted that here in Bonn we can jointly set a course for a healthy, toxin-free environment. I wish us every success for the high-level segment. I hope it will send a firm and united political signal. Such a signal will ensure a lasting focus on chemicals and waste management and speed up its implementation by all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Lemke, for your most supportive and galvanizing statement. I would like to conclude this opening segment by thanking our guest of honor for their stimulating statement this afternoon. And I will now call upon Minister Lemke to preside over this high-level segment of ICCM 5.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Pierre. Let us continue with this opening session and call on three voices: the youth, the World Bank, and the human rights perspective, to provide us with their thoughts. I invite Rachel Nestor from the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform and the Caribbean Youth Environmental Network to make a statement on amplifying youth rights and views in chemical governance. Ms. Nestor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. I am Rachel Nestor from St. Lucia, representing the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform. As part of an ongoing consultation and a capacity building process with children and youth from every region of the world on the expectations, demands, and priorities for our future of the chemicals governance, we have developed the first ever Global Youth Declaration on Chemicals and Waste. Today, I am here to present to you the advanced language of the Youth Declaration, which will be accompanied by an extended policy paper in December 2023. We, the youth of the world, recognize that we were born into and exist in a time on the edge of the ecological collapse, with ongoing crises fueled by the unsound management of chemicals and waste. In transforming our global approach to chemicals, waste, and pollution challenges, we assert our right to be actively involved, our knowledge and lived experiences to be valued, and our leadership and innovative solutions to be recognized and implemented. With the first Global Youth Declaration on Chemicals and Waste, we articulate our shared vision, collective demands, and commitment to fostering a sustainable, equitable, and toxic-free world where people and the environment are protected from the detrimental impacts of hazardous chemicals and waste. Therefore, we call upon the United Nations, governments, civil society, international organizations, and all relevant stakeholders to 1. Assert that uncontrolled and reckless practices of chemicals and waste management are an intergenerational injustice, compromising the health, human rights, environmental stability, and developmental potentials of present and future generations. 2. Recognize that children and youth experience heightened levels of exposure to hazardous chemicals and waste, unique vulnerabilities to harmful, long-term, and irreversible health impacts during different stages of growth and development, and that these specific risks require specific policies to protect the health and rights of our children and youth. 3. Identify and enhance understanding of the differentiated environmental health impacts to vulnerable population groups, including children and youth, as well as between regions through rigorous interdisciplinary research and monitoring programs. 4. Scale up funding for research, monitoring, and scientific infrastructure, such as upgraded laboratory facilities, towards sub-regions, regions, and for studies within population groups that have the least data and monitoring coverage. Support the democratization of science in chemicals and waste by recognizing and integrating diverse knowledge producers, including the indigenous peoples, local practitioners, and community scientists, and ensuring their active participation in scientific discourse and decision-making processes. 5. Harness real-time monitoring systems, digital chemistries, and artificial intelligence tools to accelerate progress on solutions in pollution elimination, incident prediction, and prevention toxic chemicals assessment, and identification of at-risk populations and ecosystems, improving the efficiency, accuracy, and comprehensiveness of environmental protection efforts. 6, ensure equitable access to monitoring data and analysis of the ecological and human health impacts to chemicals, waste, and pollution, in alignment with the principles of the right to know and the right to science. This aggregate data on human health by gender, age, region, and make this data and its analysis openly accessible in databases, maps, and other data visualization tools, and in translated publications. 7, uphold a commitment to a human rights-based approach in chemicals and waste management, emphasizing the right of every individual to a safe and healthy environment, clean water, clean air, and adequate sanitation, irrespective of their socioeconomic background, ethnicity, or geographic location. 8, in pursuit of a vision for chemical safety for all, promote accessible education around chemicals and waste management, empowering individuals and communities to access misinformation and make informed decisions about chemicals use, disposal, and decisions about their health. 9, critically analyze the transition from hazardous materials and products in the industry towards environmentally sustainable solutions based in sound science, empower the youth by offering insights into broader chemical knowledge that will inform future efforts in achieving safe and responsible industrial practices. 10, confront and rectify the disproportionate toxic material usage and disposal in marginalized communities, prioritize an indigenous peoples' rights-based approach in sustainable decision-making, including free prior informed consents, emphasize environmental justice, and prioritize investigation and remediation efforts in communities burdened by environmental hazards and legacy pollution. 11, promote innovation, safety, and sustainability in chemistry by incorporating green and sustainable chemistry, curricula in systems and degree programs across the educational continuum as means to train the future workforce to respond to current and future environmental societal challenges. 12, strengthen interlinkages between and mainstreaming of chemicals, waste, and pollution with broader frameworks, including those on climate change, biodiversity, desertification, and the global commitment and the targets of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. 13, recognize, uplift, and invest in youth-led solutions to chemical and waste crises. 14, co-design with youth as agents of change a clearly defined children and youth strategy or its interagency network across the United Nations Environment Programme, Chemicals and Waste Portfolio that will leverage existing multi-stakeholder and interagency partnerships to close gaps in how chemicals safety policies identify, address, and track progress on priority environmental health concerns to children and youth. In closing, we stand united as youth in all our diversity, ready to collaborate, innovate, and lead the way forward to a chemical, safe, and just world. We remain steadfast in our commitment to see the principles and aspirations of this declaration translated into tangible, impactful actions and outcomes for the benefit of all generations, now and in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Nestor, and all the young people who have engaged in this process for sharing your reflections, needs, and indeed demands of us. The decisions we make here will form the basis of the lives that young people will be able to live. In very much hope we can meet the needs and hopes that young people have expressed. Thank you very much again for your contribution. We will now hear and see a presentation from Valerie Hickey, Director General for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. She will talk about how the sound management of chemicals and waste can contribute to economic development and a livable planet. Mrs. Hickey, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Minister. Friends, something has to change. We need a deal, because there are just too many people who are dying before they're due. There's too many kids who can't learn today and won't be able to work tomorrow. And there are too many economies who simply can't grow because of chemical pollution. Not because of chemicals, because in fact chemicals and chemistry are the physical precursors of so much of human advancement, of so much of the scientific, technological, and agricultural innovation we've seen in our lifetimes. But it's the unchecked and unmanaged use of chemicals that has become yet another defining challenge of this century. Another horse to join the two other horses of the apocalypse, climate change and biodiversity loss. And these three horses, these three environmental crises, are not just the same because of the damage they're doing to people, to our prosperity, and to the planet. They're also similar because the truth is, we have the resources, we have the solutions to manage chemicals better, to ensure that we can benefit from their amazing upside without having to live and die because of the downsides. But we don't have that political will yet, and that's what you all have to do in these remaining hours. But in order to have that political will, we need to know the scale of the problem. We need to agree on what the numbers are. So let me share with you some numbers. First of all, let's talk about lead. Even after the global removal of lead from gasoline, which started in the 1980s and only finished with Algeria finally banning lead in gasoline in 2021, lead is still everywhere. It's in our pipes, it's in our soils, it's in our cosmetics and our cookware. But the death toll from lead is not everywhere. It's mostly in low and middle-income countries. It's in poor countries around the world and poor communities in every country. And thanks to support from the government of Germany, at the World Bank, we've tried to put a number on how many people are dying early from lead. That number is 5.5 million people. 5.5 million people dead every year because of lead poisoning. That's 6 times the previous estimates of the death toll. And that matters. Understanding the scale of the problem is key to us building the political momentum to solve it. But premature death comes at the end of a very long and harrowing road that often starts with kids who have lead poisoning, who are cursed enough with that exposure that they're doomed to have cognitive impairment for the rest of their life, to not be able to hold jobs, to not be as productive as they otherwise could, which is leading to their lower productivity, to them having less income, and to them being more vulnerable for the rest of their lives. If you add up these impacts of premature death, of cognitive impairment, the result is a huge anchor around the growth prospects of low and middle income countries. How big an anchor? Just for lead alone, the economic costs are estimated to be almost $10 trillion. Almost 8% of global GDP. Think about that. Think about what that means for the ability of countries to grow. But it's not just lead. Of the 50 or 60,000 chemicals we use, let's talk about a few more. Let's talk about cadmium. It's commonly found in fertilizers and batteries and all sorts of electronics. With sufficient exposure, It can affect the cardiovascular system. It can cause kidney failure. It causes cancer. And what are the numbers? How many people are dying from cadmium exposure? Almost 2 million people dead every year before their time. 2 million more people dead from exposure to chemicals. What about asbestos and the workers that are exposed to asbestos that we know has been a cause of many cancers for many, many years, which is why it's banned in many countries, but not in all. And there are still countries, still middle-income countries, that are increasing their use of asbestos. And when we looked at the numbers, we estimate that up to 500,000 workers, 500,000 every year, will die by 2050. So these numbers are very real. These numbers are very large. And they don't just stop with lead or cadmium or asbestos. Let's talk about nitrogen. We know how important it is for agriculture as a fertilizer. We know, in fact, that if we didn't have nitrogen, if we didn't have access to these fertilizers, the number of people who are severely food insecure today, a very cold and clinical term for people who are starving, would be a lot more than 258 million. So again, this is an example of a chemical that is so vitally important for everything we do, and yet, when not managed well, is leading to death and destruction. We know only about 40% of the nitrogen applied on farms is actually absorbed by crops. The rest of it leaches into the water, where it's creating huge dead zones, affecting marine biodiversity, affecting fisheries, affecting food security. It also gets volatilized into the air, where it turns into nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That's the impact on the planet of nitrogen. But what about the impact on people? At levels of over 10 parts per million, it causes blue baby syndrome. It's killing babies. Even at levels lower than that, it causes stunting. We're seeing it. There are measurements of kids who are smaller because of exposure to nitrogen. And what about the effects on the economy? Because using more economic fertilizer doesn't make good economic sense. A 10% increase in nitrogen fertilizer leads to less than a 2% increase in productivity. And it adds and causes almost 6% decline in labor productivity because those workers applying that fertilizer get sick. And countries are subsidizing this waste. It has to change. This is not the kind of development we want or need. We can never end poverty and build a safe and just world that Rachel talked about in a land awash with unmanaged chemicals. But this discussion today and everything that you're doing isn't about just quantifying the problem. It's about talking about solutions. And we know they matter, and we know they matter in terms of policies, institutions, and infrastructure. Policy is why we're all here this week, to strengthen SAICM, have a new framework agreement, have a new global high-level call to action. We know that this international policy framework has to think about what is a safe level of exposure to chemicals. Because we know there's no safe level of exposure to lead, for example. We must understand what safe means in the environment and where the proper use of chemical ends and overuse and harmful pollution begins. And we must apply a golden rule. Chemicals and waste that are banned at home cannot be exported overseas. But it's not just about international policy, it's about the national policy gaps too that are an invitation to further economic disaster. That's why even though it took 45 years to phase out lead from gasoline, the public bans worked. That's why we need more national evidence-based policy frameworks that incentivize the right behaviors through environmental and safety standards, talk about making polluters pay, and ending the subsidies that cause more pollution. And policy must adopt a clean it forward lens. Policy can't always just react to the last spill, to the last pollution. It has to begin to anticipate the next crisis. It has to identify ex ante what needs to be put in place to ensure the safe disposal of chemicals and the materials they infuse. It's not just about policy. Without strong institutions, even the best policies don't work. And this doesn't just mean building the capacity of ministries of environment. It means building the capacities of ministries of agriculture so the extension workers who work with farmers can explain why using less fertilizer will not reduce productivity. It means working with local retailers who sell those farmers that fertilizer so they understand what they should store and stock and sell. But even with formidable policy action and strong, credible institutions, every country also needs robust infrastructure to manage the purchase, the storage, the use and disposal of chemicals. This is an important part of the clean it forward philosophy we need to adopt. It's also important to clean up past spills and past problems. So finally, to do all of this and to turn the page on chemicals, mismanagement and pollution, we want to call for three things that we've heard a lot this week. The first is we need to focus on data and analytics. We have to have robust data that is responsive to changes in real time and can be collected even in data-poor countries. And it's made publicly available so that progress can be tracked and failure to progress can be punished. We cannot manage what we do not measure. And right now, we don't have a single agreed way to measure chemical pollution or the policies that try and combat it. We also need more money. We need more domestic resources to tackle chemicals pollution, but we know we need this at a time when fiscal space constraints and debt distress have never been higher. We need more international public finance at a time when we know the demands on this finance to combat the climate crisis, meet the ambition identified in the Global Biodiversity Framework has never been bigger. And we need lots more private capital. But we can't just talk about needing more money. We have to talk about doing more with the money we already have. Doing more, doing better, and doing faster. We have to make sure that public policy provides the certainty that private finance needs to reduce its risk and invest. We need to make sure that international public finance de-risks specific private investment deals to increase the returns of private capital so that they will invest. And we need to make sure that every pot of money that supports the management of chemicals pollution is easily and quickly accessible. We also need partnerships, whether it's across the public and private sectors, across whole of government, across whole of society, across the chemical value chain, and across the global north and south. And we need to engage local communities and those micro and small businesses that stand at the coalface and suffer the most from chemical pollution. The history of development, friends, is a story of short-term choices made in the pursuit of a grow now, clean up later philosophy. The history of pollution has taught us that cleaning up later has usually meant not cleaning up at all. Now that bill has come due, and the people who have to pay it, the almost 10 million people who are dying every year in their families just from exposure to 4 chemicals alone, and the kids who, because of exposure to chemistry, to poor chemistry, to mismanaged chemistry, will never grow up to have the lives we've been lucky enough to live. They're the people who have to pay for this bill that has come due, and they have the least ability to pay for it. Something has got to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hickey, for this important contribution. It is a key to understanding the enormous impacts of unsustainable chemicals management on our health, our environment, and our economies. We cannot afford not to find and pursue solutions. Thank you. Another important perspective on the issues we are discussing here is that of human rights. I would like to invite Marcos Orellana, Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, to make his statement on the centrality of human rights for the sound management of chemicals and wastes. Mr. Orellana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Minister, very much for giving me the floor. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, I am honored to be with you here today. My message today is rather simple. Humanity cannot afford to aggravate the toxification of our planet. We need strong tools to confront the global toxic tide, and human rights offers those tools. Every year, millions of people lose their lives as a result of exposure to hazardous substances. Many more suffer illnesses and hardship. This exposure is preventable because it is a political choice. Today, I come to encourage you to embrace a bold vision where we all choose to protect human lives, health, and the environment. To make this vision a reality, we must move away from narrow self-interests that lead to a zero-sum game where humanity and planet lose. Human rights can help overcome this perverse dynamic by leading our collective efforts toward a world where every person can enjoy the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and no one is left behind. At times, certain industry interests have pushed a tale where human rights are opposed to economic development. This is, simply put, a tactic to divert our attention. What human rights actually oppose is exploitation, discrimination, and abuse. Conversely, what human rights set out to achieve is a world free from fear and want, in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's take the right to science, for example. This right welcomes technology and innovation at the service of human rights. It also requires the alignment between best available science and regulatory measures. Today, however, there is a wide chasm between the scientific evidence on the risks and harms posed by chemicals and the measures established to prevent exposure. This is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate disinformation by unscrupulous interests that stand to profit from the lack of protections. It is the result of corporate capture of governments by industries that are guided only by their immediate financial profits. What's the end result? A planetary chemical crisis of unprecedented proportions that is inflicting harm to countless individuals and even threatening to alter some of the defining traits of our common human nature, such as our intelligence and fertility. Human rights provide a moral compass and norms to confront the global chemical crisis. When we consider the right to information, for example, it is well known that we lack information on most of the hundreds of thousands of chemicals in the market. We lack information on chemicals in the products that we use. Information would empower society to demand stronger protections. I sometimes hear that if we could only safely manage and minimize the risks of chemicals, then society would benefit from chemical innovations. This argument is conceptually seductive, but it ignores the distance between an assumption and reality. A human rights-based approach can help bridge this distance because it calls upon us to look at reality from the perspective of those individuals and groups in most vulnerable situations: indigenous peoples, workers, including in the informal sector, peasants, women, children, and other groups often left behind in our societies. From the standpoints of those who suffer, words like minimizing risks are plainly words devoid of meaning. In the real world, people face serious environmental injustices from chemical exposure. The right to a healthy environment is a strong ally in their pursuit of protection and remedies. Perhaps that is why this right is so opposed by some who would rather remain unaccountable for the harm they have inflicted on the planet and humanity. But international morality calls upon us to address global environmental injustices. This involves putting an end to the odious double standards, such as in the export of banned hazardous pesticides. It involves mobilizing substantial resources for international cooperation and solidarity. It involves applying due diligence in supply and value chains. It also involves overcoming the legacy of environmental racism and the enduring forms of environmental violence. To conclude, I wish to invite you to achieve this vision of human rights as the common ground that will allow us to work together to overcome the global chemicals crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Orellana, for highlighting the multiple human rights-related aspects of chemicals and waste management, including the need to recognize the specific vulnerabilities of different social groups. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to thank all speakers again for the key messages that they have contributed. These are all key points for this high-level segment, including the high-level declaration, the development of which the ICCM5 president has been leading. I would like to invite my dear colleague Anita Breyer, President of the 5th session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management, to introduce the high-level declaration, the process of its development and progress made so far. Madam President, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, friends. I have been requested to share with you the progress that your delegations made in preparing a high-level declaration as one of the key outcomes of this international conference for your consideration. In order to prepare this high-level declaration, we have undertaken extensive consultation and worked together with all countries and stakeholders. In 2020 and 2021, we initiated an informal drafting group process to gather and synthesize the views from all. The postponement of our conference in 2021 due to the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, due to the pandemic and 2021, the second time triggered us to once again request all stakeholders to submit further views on the substantive content of this high-level declaration. I must say we have had a tremendous response to these requests for input from all. I, as President, then synthesized a zero draft declaration based on these inputs and published it in the lead up to this conference. On Monday this week, we established an informal group to discuss and elaborate the shape and content of a high-level declaration for your consideration. And I thank very much my friends Mohamed Kashashne and Eva Kracht for leading this group. We have made tremendous progress on the draft declaration thus far. It is short and concise. It outlines the global challenges we face and clearly identifies the priority areas to be addressed as we go forward. It communicates our determination and commitment to take urgent and ambitious action on these global challenges. There are a few areas that remain to be clarified. For your information, you will find the draft uploaded as an in-session document on the website, and I encourage you to engage on the substantive content of this draft and guide your negotiators as they finalize the work on it. We aim to consider and adopt the high-level declaration before we close our session tomorrow. And with the help of the growing bond spirit in this room, that is, the bond spirit is the one of live and let live, we will be able to manage that, to solve these outstanding issues. And with the inspiration and your pointing out to the urgency of the matter on this podium right now, I think that will help all of us, all delegates, to be motivated, well motivated for hard work for one more night. But I hope it will be the last night, or I impose on you it should be the last night that we are doing that. So thank you very much for your support, for inspiring us and giving us additional motivation. And thank you to all of you for really investing all this time and your dedication to the subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for this introduction and overview, and for your leadership in preparing and further developing the high-level declaration. And I want to say thank you, everyone, for the hard work in the nights and on days. And I welcome further work to finalize the declaration in the next night. I would now like to invite Nikhil Seth, Assistant Secretary General and the Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, to moderate a brief session with key stakeholders and their reflections on the messages we have heard.
Distinguished Minister Stephy Lemke, Inge Anderson, the head of UNEP, and your passionate teams. I use the word passionate because I know tireless they've been, but they brought a degree of passion into this work which I think is urgently needed. For the last hour, we've heard some outstanding contributions. Thank you for bringing all these people here, Germany, and thank you for what you have conveyed to this multi-stakeholder audience. This is what we need, and this is the urgency of now. Before diving into this reflections on what we've heard over the last hour, we give and hear the European Commissioner for the Environment, Oceans and Fisheries for a short statement, and then we'll dive into the panel on reflections. So, distinguished Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius, I give you the floor.
Dear Minister Lemke, dear Inge Andersen, dear colleagues, first of all, let me thank Germany for its unwavering leadership in preparing and organizing this international conference on chemicals management. Chemicals contribute to our well-being, our health, our wealth, and we cannot do without chemicals. The chemical industry also employs 120 million people worldwide, leading to nearly 1 billion jobs in downstream sectors. And yet, there is a downside. Chemical pollution poses a heavy burden on human and economic development. We heard from the World Bank that the cost of exposure to environmental chemicals is more than 10% of the global GDP. Air pollution is the cause of 7 million premature deaths per year. And that corresponds to entire population of country I am from, Lithuania, plus Latvia, Estonia, and Cyprus, put together. So the question is, do we just accept that, or do we take action? In 2015, the world agreed on an ambitious global sustainable development agenda. That agenda recognizes the cross-cutting nature of sound management of chemicals and waste as a crucial condition for achieving many objectives and targets. Worldwide chemical pollution is recognized as the third element of the triple planetary crisis, next to climate change and biodiversity loss. There is a growing mountain of evidence showing the adverse effects of hazardous chemicals on human health and the environment, if they are not properly managed. What do we owe to future generations? How do we balance the interests of the present and the future? How can we ensure that our actions today do not deprive the opportunities of those who will come after us? And let me focus on one class of chemicals, specifically endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are especially problematic, and they affect people and animals at critical moments in the body when it is vulnerable, such as during fetal development, early childhood, or puberty. And they mimic the body's own hormones. Their effects are permanent on a person, and not only. They can even be passed on to the next generation. And studies have estimated that the cost of harm by endocrine disruptors to European society as ranging between 46 and 288 billion euros per year. In the EU, we are taking action. Endocrine disruption did not exist as a specific hazard class in our legislation. But since the beginning of this year, it finally does. We're also taking action to introduce these hazard classes to the UN globally harmonized system so that these chemicals can be identified and regulated not only in Europe, but worldwide. This was an action announced in Europe's chemical strategy for sustainability. It is a strategy that aims high, and we want to achieve a toxic-free environment where chemicals contribute to society while avoiding harm to the planet and to current and future generations. Chemicals are quite literally the building blocks of our future. When we think of low carbon, zero pollution, or resource-efficient technologies, we are actually thinking of chemicals. But to control the dangers, we need a global approach. And the transition to a green and sustainable economy, as outlined in the European Green Deal, can also guide international negotiations on the framework for chemicals and waste. The EU has supported and will continue to strongly support efforts aiming at achieving the sound management of chemicals and waste at global level. We will continue to support capacity building and strengthen institutions to improve implementation of multilateral and national instruments on chemicals and waste. And this conference is expected to adopt an ambitious international framework on chemicals and waste management. A framework that is adapted to the level of urgency, with an ambition that must be higher and more inclusive than the 2020 goals of the strategic approach to chemicals management. The planet needs new chemicals and waste framework that is adopted to reaching the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. People expect adequate responses to the current crisis. The global community has shown through recent resolutions adopted under UNEA and WHO that it's ready to take the necessary action. So we need a spirit of cooperation and responsibility. We need to be ready to compromise, whilst aiming at the highest level of ambition possible. We need a strong commitment. A commitment for a better world for our children and grandchildren. We have tools. We have science and the knowledge. We must drive that change. I count on you, all of you together, to drive that change today. Thank you.
It's time to get into our panel, who will reflect upon the wonderful things we've heard through this morning. And I'd invite each one of them to come to this part of this side of the room and join me here. We have representatives from UNDP, from UNIDO, from WHO and ILO. There's Hao Liang, there's Mr. Zhu, there's Maria Neira and Mr. Nunes. So please join me here. Hi, Julian. So while they are assembling here, let me sort of tell all of you that what I'm hoping to do is invoke the bond spirit which you referred to. And the bond spirit is a spirit for not so much reflection and analytics, but a spirit of action. And the distinguished minister has made some wonderful announcements this morning, including a contribution to keep that part of the operation going, which requires, as everyone said, finances. And we are all enthused. It's something in the air in Bonn which promotes action. And I think we have to have that spirit as we discuss and think about what has been said. Now, coming back to what we heard, what struck me is a certain commonality in everything that was said. The urgency of action was something which was brought up really by every speaker. And whether you approach it from intergenerational justice, or you approach it from human rights, or you approach it from the people, prosperity, planet, and the impact of growth prospects, there is no question that all of us in this room are agreed that we need to do something now. And I wanted all of you to focus on this and look at the future. We don't want too much emphasis, because time is very limited. We don't want too much of a focus on the analytics. We know, everyone has told us that it's a very grim, dark situation. And we want you to throw light on, first, in your individual capacities, forget your institutions. What were the thoughts that came to your mind when you listened to all these speeches? And what made you alert to the mismanagement issues that come around chemicals and waste management? And in your personal capacity, I'll come back for the next round of questions to your institutions and what you represent. But Hao Liang, let me start with you. What are the thoughts right on top of your mind which you want to share with this wonderful audience here?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikki. I think in my personal capacity, what came to my mind is really, what kind of a world we're living for our future generations. Right? We heard very impassionate statement from our youth representative. Right? We have examples for cities that have developed, but they discovered that the cost of cleanup is more than the GDP, accumulative GDP that have received over a 30-year period. Right? So we don't want to repeat this kind of reckless path of development. We needed to think about our future generations. That's really what came to my mind.
Thank you. Actually, one thing I think struck me here is not about the urgency of having this deal done here. I think most important now why we are here, we do not have this consensus. That lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of the scale of the problems. This is, I think, the most, daunting task we need to tackle together. So we say for the youth, now we have the declaration, the youth generation, that now already developed this understanding. But for the ordinary public, not only experts here, professionals here, policymakers, then all the concerns they should be, coming together to understand the level of the challenges, the risks, like the climate crisis, like the biodiversity loss crisis. No, for why? For this chemical crisis, pollution crisis, we could not reach the level of understanding of the urgency. So that's why I think this is something critical for us to move things forward. Thank you.
You know, my first reflection is great. We are all aligned. I didn't hear anyone disagreeing. I heard the youth telling us that we need to do more, and I heard a very detailed list of requests. I heard the human rights approach telling us that there's a good argument for that. I heard head of agencies like Inger telling us that from an environmental point of view is so important. I heard ministers telling us as well that the governments are committed. I heard the European Commission telling us that they have a strategy, a zero pollution. And of course, I hear myself and my organization saying the health argument is very powerful, enormous. The figures are really devastating, the impact on public health. So my second reflection is, what is wrong then? If we are all aligned, we are all convinced, where are the obstacles? Who is presenting any obstacle? If all from governments, NGOs, civil society, UN organizations, why we don't start? So my reflection will be, okay, let's finish this declaration and go immediately back and start to do it, because we all recognize that there are three crises, the pollution, loss of biodiversity, and climate change that are biggest crisis that we need to confront. So I think the rhetoric has played already a role. Now we need to understand where are the obstacles and remove it.
I think I agree very much with what Dr. Lemke said. The speaker's microphone is not working. Will be at the same time. Can you hear? Your microphone is not working. Use mine. No, it's working. So I thought it was working, so I hope that it's good now. I was saying that I leave, from Bonn this week, concerned and hopeful. Well, concerned because I was listening carefully to, namely the presentation from the World Bank, and I saw all the numbers and the fact that lead continues to kill workers and people, every day, or if not every day, almost every day. And I thought to myself, one of the first international labor standards of the ILO, already in 1919, so more than 100 years ago, was exactly on protection of workers from lead. So I was asking myself exactly what Dr. Nera just said. So what has failed so that, over a century, we were not able to prevent this death, at least death attributable to exposure to occupational risk factors, to happen? So this is my concern, and it seems that, we are achieving here a very important outcome, but maybe we need to accelerate progress. And again, for me, it's very important that we recognize, and we are recognizing that, all sectors are relevant. And we cannot separate environment, health, and labor. And we can also separate the application of different international frameworks. So it's very important, of course, the high-level declaration that we'll achieve here, the new framework also for the safe management of chemicals. But, for example, complement this and use the strength of normative frameworks that already exist. And here I leave this for my next intervention, speaking about the ILO. Thank you.
Thank you for that first response in your individual capacities. Anita just told us that we are on the cusp of a significant declaration, and we'll get that. It's a matter of hours, maybe sleepless hours, but we are almost there. Now my question to you is institutional. You have a pre-declaration world in each of your institutions, and you're bound to have a post-declaration world. What are you doing in each of your institutions, or what will you do to make this declaration a reality in the lives of people everywhere? And to you, Julian, I specifically focus on UNDP's very large infrastructure of country offices, particularly in the poorer parts of the world. How are things going to change? How are you going to program issues that we've been discussing, which are contained in the declaration, into the work we are doing at the country level? So that's my question to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Time's short, so I'll try to be succinct. But it's a really big question. I think the fact is that all of us have been working on sustainable management of chemicals and waste for some time. But what we need is a scale, right? Scale of impact. So while UNDP is working with partners with different funding sources, vertical funds, in 80 countries, right, with a $400 million portfolio, it's not enough. It's far from enough. So we need to focus on how to work together in partnerships to get to a bigger scale. This is one. Secondly, I would really focus on the question of governance. Broadly speaking, I'm a firm believer that the quality of governance determines the outcome of development. Specifically for chemicals and waste management, it's the same. Right? So we need to learn from each other. There are good examples of legislations, policies, and institutions. Right? So I think the UNDP will increasingly focusing on these kind of issues to ensure that there's a local, national leadership and the results are sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. For you, Mr. Zhu, what will UNIDO do differently?
Thank you for this very important question. For UNIDO, of course, firstly, that support the point made by Julian about the scale. For UNIDO, we have also a strong portfolio in the field of chemicals management, but still the scale compared to need and the task ahead still very small. We need now, I think, to expand our kind of partnership with UN sister agencies, with private sector in the field for the promotion of sustainable value chains and the circular economy approach to the sound management of chemicals and waste. In addition, also we need to promote some innovative business models, such as chemical leasing. I think this is also very successful approach. UNIDO has been promoted for years. We would like to also promote this further. Thank you.
Maria, WHO, you are at the center of it all from the health perspectives. Do you think you've been doing enough over the years, and what are you going to do differently?
In public health, you can never think that you are doing enough. Never enough. I mean, we are never satisfied. Our level of ambition is as high as has no limit, because it's about protecting public health. What we are trying to do is to use the health argument to mobilize more action and to make sure that we remove all of those obstacles. But not only giving the health argument in terms of how many deaths, which I think is horribly dramatic already, when you look only at the air pollution, mentioned it already here, according to WHO, 7 million premature deaths every year, plus the cost for chronic diseases, plus the cost for our health systems. Don't forget that most of the cost that this inaction is already paid by our health system. This is never considered in many calculations, but our hospitals are already paying for the cost of this bad management of chemicals. But we use as well the health argument, I hope, in positive, in the sense that I don't think we use it enough, the fact that if we are all a little bit more intelligent now, if our IQ in this room is probably a little bit better than in previous generations, is because we have removed lead from gasoline. Maybe we need to provide more positive examples of what happened when we did some interventions, and this is what we are trying to do, making sure that the ministers of health are part of this conversation. They are the ones responding to most of those questions in our hospitals, and by using the health argument, both in giving the scientific evidence, but as well providing those interventions that will protect our health, I think that this is where we can have a comparative advantage. And hopefully for the next meeting, we will be even more intelligent, and then we will take more action on removing the wrong chemicals in our society.
When those health ministers come to your health assembly, make sure you have this item high on the agenda so that they can go and translate it into some of their national health systems. Joachim, from ILO, what do you have to say?
So for the ILO, I think that what is happening here this week comes at the very best moment. And why? Well, first of all, because since last year, we have something of major importance, not only for the ILO, but I think that for all of us here in the room, the fact that we have now occupational safety and health recognized as what we call in the ILO a fundamental labor right. And I'm saying this because this has practical implications for almost all of you here. Why? Because the fundamental rights of the ILO and the conventions that are defined as fundamental conventions, all of our member states, so probably all of your countries in the room, have the obligation to respect, to promote, and to realize in good faith the principles contained in those conventions. And one of the principles contained in these conventions is that all member states, all governments, should put in practice a national policy, a national program, and a national system that needs to cover all occupational hazards. So my message here would be for all of us to work together in terms of, as I just mentioned before, making the best use of all international frameworks that we have out there, and also very much being clever enough to use the teeth that international labor standards of the ILO have to help us to promote the safe management of chemicals, which of course have effects not only on the health of workers, but also on the environment and public health.
Thank you, Joachim. Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the room, you have people who are representatives from the United Nations. And I'm making a confession here, but as United Nations, we feel most comfortable working with governments. But over the last hour and a half, you've heard multi-stakeholder partnerships, the engagement of academia, the engagement of young people, the engagement of the business sector, companies, industry, all more centrally in getting the outcome of what we are going to decide on today happen. So the last question I'm going to ask all these stalwarts from the UN system is, what kind of attitudinal shift do we all need to make in our institutions? And will that be the part of the thing that motivates you as you go ahead in implementing this agenda? Starting with you.
Okay, thank you. I think clearly the United Nations has adopted a very clear and committed approach to multi-stakeholder participation. And I'll give one example. I think in the areas of financing, for example, which is an area that developing countries are putting a lot of emphasis on, right? And has been mentioned by earlier speakers. We're working with more than 80 countries to develop what's called integrated national financing frameworks, right? Because if a development priority of a country is not reflected in your financing strategy, development financing strategy, it will not be done, right? So the financing strategy needs to include public resources, both national and international, as well as private resources, domestic and international. For this purpose, on the public side, for example, there are a lot of issues. We need a multi-stakeholder approach. How do you deal with the very difficult question of chemicals or the subsidies for agricultural subsidies, for example, right, for inputs? So that cannot be determined by governments alone, right? On the private sector side, for example, if their investment truly takes into consideration the net zero and the nature positive principles, then their investments will be supportive of the national development goals and the national financing strategies. So multi-stakeholder approach, yes, for sure.
Mr. Zhu, how will you get this into the DNA of UNIDO, multi-stakeholder thinking?
Thank you. Actually, for UNIDO, since we have very, very close this cooperation with the private sector, industry always say the solutions, technologies are from private sector. So we have a long history of cooperation with private sector in the UN system. Now, in this case, of course, for chemist industry, this is a big industry. For us, we need to work together with, firstly, the companies there, then together also with academia to find the solutions, alternatives. This is something critical. And another thing is that how to also work with other, say, MDBs, with this kind of public, international public financing, to really to support this kind of capacity in the developing world. So among these, also capacity, then technology transfer. So we have this platform of ITPO really to promote this kind of technologies in Germany, in Japan, in Republic of Korea to the developing world. So we have this investment platform to foster the kind of cooperation. We definitely will contribute from this part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Maria, how will WHO get out of its fixation with health ministries?
Well, you know that health doesn't start at the hospital. On the contrary, this is where we go when we do not have health. So health starts on the way we decide on the sources of energy we are using, on the way we build our cities, on the way we have our production of food, on the way we use our chemicals. And therefore, more and more, the health community needs to be empowered to infiltrate, if you allow me to use that word, to influence decisions that the ministers of environment, ministers of energy, ministers of finance, they need to take. So health is not just the absence of disease, as you well know. That's why more and more you will hear the voice of the health community infiltrated in other areas. Now that we are working more and more on climate change, we need to solve this crisis of pollution. You will hear more and more the voice of the health professionals, providing the arguments as well, motivating. I think the health community is still among the most credible, so maybe we need to use that voice to more and more making sure that health is promoted, prevented, and address at source. And what keeps me motivated? I think the health of our lungs, the fact that we can protect the brain development of our children, the fact that you could reduce even by 20% the mortality. So those are things that should be kept motivated, not only the health professionals, but all of you. So I count on all of you to look at how to measure your interventions by the way we reduce the mortality associated with that. That will be really a great motivation for me.
Thank you, Maria. And finally, ILO, you have a tripartite structure of governance. Who of this tripartite structure would be your strongest allies in making this implementation happen?
Well, all of them, of course. This is not just a politically correct answer, it is the truth. But I would say even more than our tripartite structure, again, as you know, we work mostly with ministers of labor and of course, employers and workers' organizations. But what we need, thinking of the UN, is that we all have different constituencies. So we have labor, we have health, we have environment, but it shouldn't stop there. We have to think of migration, we have to think of gender, we have to think of so many interconnected issues that require the intervention of, well, I would say, if not all, most of the UN agencies. And the same would apply at national level. So when we use this now very famous jargon of the whole of government approaches, this is true. We can only address all that's happening, with climate change, pollution, death at work, if also at national level we work all together to define, to formulate, the best policies, the best regulations, to enforce legislation. This is of paramount importance. And I have to say that it doesn't always happen. And we heard, for example, during the events that we have organized here throughout the week, that sometimes, there's challenges that are still to be addressed when it comes to coordination of different institutions. So, just to finish, because you started with the ILO constituents, just to say, bring also at national level the ILO constituents, to your discussions. Bring the employers' organizations, bring the workers' organizations, bring labor, because they will have a very useful word to say, and I'm sure that this will be helpful to address any kind of challenge that we may have related to chemicals management.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to an end of this panel reflections on the wonderful statements we heard from the youth representatives, from Valerie from UN, from the World Bank, and on the human rights approach, and of course Anita's own presentation on the progress of the ICCM process, process. I just wanted to end really by referring back to what the World Bank said, what Valerie Hicks said. Please forgive me for using your summary as a kind of approach for the future. And I think the 4 or 5 elements she mentioned was, first, policy changes. We clearly need policy changes. Second, we need institutional changes. Every institution needs to change to be able to think these challenges differently. Thirdly, we need solid data and analytics which should guide our work. We need money. We need partnerships, and with all this, something you didn't mention, we need leadership in all our institutions to make all this happen. But here I end by thanking the leadership of Germany. I have watched their engagement in this process for a long time now, and it's amazing what you've done to bring us to this room at this stage, and the progress you've made in reaching a conclusion to these wonderful deliberations. So thank you, everyone, and that's the end of our panel discussion. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much, Nikhil Seth, for leading this important panel, and I thank Commissioner Sinkevicius and all panelists who have shared their reflections just now. As a last substantive contribution to our opening session of the high-level segment, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Robert Habeck, Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and Vice Chancellor of Germany, who has kindly provided a video message to our conference.
Minister Lemke, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to share a few words with you today. In a globalized and increasingly interconnected world, it is becoming more and more important to protect people and the environment against the negative effects of chemical substances. The strategic approach to international chemical management is currently the only instrument at international level that focuses on responsible chemical management. Climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Our planet is experiencing a triple crisis. We will all have to work extremely hard to master these enormous challenges. The chemical industry, as a driving force for innovation and progress, has a key role to play in this. To be more specific, chemicals enable innovations, and innovations produce chemical substances and products that are both sustainable and safer. Chemicals are used in virtually all parts of our lives, which is why it is so important that they are handled safely and that a differentiated risk-based approach is taken regarding their use. Chemistry makes use of reactivity. Without it, there would be no chemical transformation. Without reactivity, none of us would be here today. However, it is clear that the use of chemical substances needs to focus more systemically on innovative and future-proof solutions for our sustainable development. This means creating an environment for innovation that allows for a safer use of chemicals whilst upholding the indispensable diversity of the chemicals we use. the chemicals industry is aware of its responsibility to minimize the use of hazardous substances in their supply chains. What we need is a solid framework to enable all the stakeholders to manage chemicals at the global level. This can only be done successfully if businesses, governments, and society work together. Here, too, SACEM is leading the way, showing what can be achieved through cooperation. When it comes to establishing the necessary capacities for chemicals management, the chemicals industry is a reliable and essential partner, and it is already active at the global level. The Responsible Care Initiative is just a good example for this. As Paracelsus noted back in the day, almost every chemical substance has dangerous properties. These are often linked to the technical requirements of their use. However, when chemicals are assessed, we need to ensure that they can be used safely across the entire life cycle. This means that a risk-based approach is needed. Apart from the chemicals industry, downstream sectors have a certain responsibility to develop solutions. There is a lot of global activity already, and businesses are not only willing to improve, they are being proactive. Let us use this momentum to continue the constructive and targeted work under SACEM. I wish you a good and successful discussion. Thank you very much.
We thank Vice-Chancellor Habeck for his inspiring remarks, highlighting important links of our work with necessary transformations in the economy that are emerging more and more. Colleagues, allow me to make a few announcements before we conclude our session here. We will now move to our thematic roundtables, which will be held in closed session. In the session that will now follow, we will discuss 3 core topics on ways forward for implementing the global chemicals and waste agenda. You have all received a guidance note explaining the content and format of the discussions. I would like to ask my high-level colleagues and accompanying staff for the roundtables to switch locations for this part of the program. On our way to the thematic roundtables, we would like to take our traditional family photo for all high-level participants. Before we leave, I will hand over to the SACEM Secretariat to provide brief logistical information for the photo and the roundtables.
Thank you. We would like to invite the participants of the roundtable to move from the World Conference Center main building to the plenary building where the roundtable will take place. This is where the high-level group photo will be taken on the flight of stairs on Rhine level in the plenary building. This building is situated across the World Conference Center main building and can be reached via the Rhine level of the World Conference Center main building. The high-level segment delegate will be ushered there